What is going on, everyone? So in this week's video, we are going to take an in-depth look at the Intrepid 8x10 camera. I've had this camera for a while now. I actually got it back during the spring, and I wanted to make sure I had an opportunity to properly work with the camera in the field for a while in order to sort of formulate my thoughts on the camera and kind of how it worked and show some examples and sorts of stuff along those lines. I brought this to the wilds of Utah for a spring backpacking trip. And I did end up with several portfolio shots from that trip, so needless to say, the camera worked out quite well. It should also be noted, as a matter of full disclosure, that I did not pay for this camera, though I did receive it in exchange for doing some video tutorials for Intrepid Camera Company. They actually don't know that I'm doing this review, and all the opinions in this review are of my own. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Intrepid 8x10 camera. So let's start by taking a look at the Intrepid 8x10 in its folded state. It is a very slim camera, and it weighs a little less than 5 pounds, which is pretty impressive given that my Arca Swiss camera is going to weigh more than twice that. And the weight of it is certainly very impressive, but the fact that it folds down so slim in a very compact package is also incredibly important, especially when you're backpacking with the camera, because the weight of this equipment certainly adds up, but more so the bulk is actually what can make it a little bit difficult at times. So to open up the camera, we're going to have a knob there, and on the other side, there and there. So basically what we're going to do is we are going to loosen those knobs. So I'm going to loosen these guys, and these ones here, and then this is going to open up, and there is a sort of indent position on these guys. I'm going to lock that in place. And now I'm going to, before tightening these guys down, just make sure that the camera is squared up. And for that, you can actually look right on the back here. The lines of the plywood actually are a good indicator. And I see that I'm not quite there, but I'm pretty close. So that will lock down there. Let me check the other side here. I find this is really important to make sure that you kind of zero out the movements when you're setting up the camera. So with that now in place, I'm going to lock these guys down. The front standard is going to kind of unfold like this. I know you guys can't see the holes here, but there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 holes that you can put this knob into. I'll be using a 240mm lens, which is a slightly wider than normal lens. I find that works best in the second hole here. It's going to lock this in place. I'm going to kind of line things up again to kind of square up the movements. Lock down the tripod head here. And then to set up the front standard, there's an indent right there that I'm going to aim for. I'm going to pull it forward. I'm going to lock down this side as well as this side. I'll spin this around so you guys can see it. You're going to want to make sure that the front standard is nice and flush with the metal rails here. I'm going to actually move this forward just a little bit like that. Lock it down to get everything all nice and squared up. So if I kind of spin the camera around here, you'll see that it is stored in the vertical position. This is really, really important. This camera cannot be stored with the ground glass in the horizontal position. I think it has to do with just trying to keep the camera really, really slim. The hinging mechanism interferes with the these tabs and this right here if it is in the horizontal position. So you gotta make sure that keep it vertical when you're storing it. Most of the photography I do is with the camera in the horizontal position. So it does take that extra little step to go ahead and change it over, but it's not a big deal. All you do is just loosen these 2 screws right here, and you pull off the ground glass like so, and then you go ahead and rotate it. One thing I will mention, and I have not fixed this yet intentionally, there are these magnets that go in these holes in the back, which is nice because it allows it to snap into place. But one of them on mine was not glued in there all the way, so it would have a tendency to kind of get lost and end up in the wrong spot. So I'll need to kind of glue that back in. When that first happened, it took me a little while to kind of figure out what was going on and why I couldn't secure it in place, mostly because that magnet was kind of doubling up and not allowing it to fully close. You need to be really careful about this lower corner right here. You gotta make sure that that locks in place fully there. And then once that is secured, You can go ahead and tighten this down here. Lock the head in place. You can lock it down just like that, and then put just enough tension on those knobs to hold it in place. If we look at the ground glass in the back, I was actually pretty darn happy with the ground glass. Even though I am used to the ground glass on my Arca Swiss camera, which is an incredibly nice ground glass, this one worked out really well. There's a grid in there. It should be mentioned that there are some wood pieces here, 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 and here that may obstruct the viewpoint a little bit. It's actually mostly the top and bottom ones. The side ones really don't get in the way too much. It'll just cut into the image area a little bit when you're viewing it on the ground glass, but you know, when your film holder goes in there, it doesn't get in the way. So now if we go towards the front of the camera and take a look at the front standard here, a couple things worth mentioning. So you have these knobs right here control both the front tilt like this, as well as the front rise and fall. And I do wish that there were dual knobs up there, kind of like the 3rd generation 4x5 from Intrepid, because it would make sort of the more fine-tuned adjustments a little easier to work with. But it does get the job done. I also wish the screws were a little bit longer, because by the time you loosen these knobs, a couple more turns and then it will back out all the way. So just be very mindful of that. I did do one adjustment here on the front standard. So I'm going to loosen this here so that we can see underneath. So when the Intrepid 8x10 ships, there will be 3 pieces of grip tape that go on the bottom, which stops it from sliding like here, because otherwise you have the wood of the base of the front standard against the wood of the focusing bed here. It has a hard time kind of gripping it, holding it in place. It's a really nice idea in order to make it not move like that. But what I found is that those 3 pieces of grip tape add to a fair amount of instability. So if I spin the camera around right here, so you can see it from the side, with the grip tape in place, it was very unstable from this standpoint right here, especially when using kind of a longer lens. The rear standard is quite stable, but the front, there's a little bit of an issue there. On their 4x5, I found that if you take some Gaffers tape and you simply wrap it around the front standard there, it really helps enormously, both from a twisting standpoint, but also from a stability standpoint. So if I align this up right here, kind of square that out, tighten it down, it's very stable on the front and also doesn't want to twist. I'm sure there's all kinds of different brands of gaff tape that will work really well. In this case, I found that using the Savage brand gaff tape worked really, really well in particular. Another thing worth mentioning, the camera does have rear movements. And so if I were to loosen these guys and these guys here, I do have the ability to tilt forward and backwards. In the horizontal position, you are going to kind of run into some stuff there a little bit, but really wasn't too big of a deal actually in the field itself. But you do have some rear movements, which is pretty nice. Another thing too, which I found, which is kind of cool, is if you're looking for a quick release plate for the Intrepid 8x10, this one is really awesome. This is made by Kessler. It's called the Kwik stand. You'll find it linked to down below in the show notes. It's very unique because it has these wings right here, which give really nice side-by-side support. I find if you use just a normal Arca Swiss type plate on there, you don't have as much side-to-side support. This applies to any sort of view camera really. So I highly recommend getting one of these plates. It will go into the dual threads that are provided by Intrepid. So I find that that really helps out enormously in order to keep the camera nice and stable on the tripod. Because 8x10, let's face it, it's kind of finicky. They'll act like a sail in the wind, and so any chance we have to keep it stable is a pretty nice thing. Then up front here, I have a lens adapter board. This is an SK Grimes one. There's all kinds of different options out there, including one from Intrepid. But it's really nice if you can use a lens adapter board. That way you can go ahead and put your lenses on a smaller lens board. This is a Cinar board that is standard on there. This is a Linhof Technica style board, which is about the size you'd really need as far as using the lenses on here. But that's how you get the camera set up. That's the overall design of it. Next up, we're going to take a look at lens suggestions, what it's compatible with, and go from there. When it comes to lenses, you're going to want to keep the lenses on the Intrepid 8x10 very lightweight. Though it can technically handle a lens like this, which is my most commonly used lens on my Arca Swiss camera, this is a heavy lens. This lens weighs somewhere between 2 and 3 pounds. This is a 300mm f5.6 Nikkor lens. I love it, but it's quite a bit of weight for such a lightweight camera. So instead, look for lighter weight lenses. This is a lens with the exact same focal length as the other one, but instead of being a 5.6 aperture, this is an f8.5 aperture. So by losing just over 1 stop of light, I now have a very lightweight lens. So the 3 lenses that I'm using on my Intrepid 8x10 are this is the Fuji 300mm. This is the C version of the lens, f8.5. Very, very lightweight. Ends up being kind of a normal focal length on 8x10. The lens on this camera right now is the 240mm, which is slightly wider angle than normal lens. So this is the Fujinon A 240mm f9. These both will cover the 8x10 just fine. And finally, on the longer side, I have the Fujinon C 450mm f 12.5. So they're all pretty lightweight, pretty compact lenses, and they will not overwhelm the front standard of the Intrepid 8x10. The longest focal length that I've used on this camera is the 450mm. The bellows will not accommodate a 600mm, but that would be quite a massive feat because that's a huge amount of extension. The widest angle lens I've used on it is a Nikkor 150mm lens, which is a really large lens. It's like this double hourglass shaped lens. And that will work on here fine because it's kind of pulled back in, but definitely try to keep the lenses as lightweight as possible. And also, as I mentioned earlier, put your lenses on the Technica style boards. These are the Linhof Technica style boards, and get yourself an adapter. That way your lenses are nice and small, because otherwise, if you're using the full size Cinar boards, the lenses end up being really, really big and really bulky. But that's my tip. Keep your lenses really lightweight when working with the Intrepid 8x10. So let's talk about the pros and cons of the Intrepid 8x10 camera. And this is based on my experience of using the camera in the field on my backpacking trip this past spring. So first of all, I love the fact that this camera is so light and also so slim when folded down. You figure this is a camera that weighs less than 5 pounds, which is, it's half the weight of my Arca Swiss, and it's also about half the weight of the Ebony camera that I used in the past for backpacking. The Ebony camera folded down pretty nice and compact, which is great, but this is even slimmer, which means I can fold this camera down and have several film holders and still have a smaller overall package than the Ebony. This is important because on my spring trip, it allowed me to carry an extra film holder, which is really nice. Before, when I'd gone on backpacking trips, I could only carry so many because the bulk itself kind of gets in the way. So even though this is a very lightweight camera, the fact that it folds down and be so slim is also really important. I also really like the way that the focusing works on this camera. So basically you loosen this knob right here and then you have a nice geared focus. It's really smooth, and I felt like it had plenty of precision when I was focusing shots in the field. So I was really happy with that. I really do like the ground glass, so that worked out really well. I really have no complaints about that, even though I'm used to using the ground glass on my Arca Swiss camera. So that was really nice. I also appreciate the fact that it has the rear movements. So let's talk about the bellows a little bit. So the bellows are a very lightweight and also weather-resistant synthetic material, which is pretty nice. I did inspect the bellows when I got the camera, just to look for any light leaks. I did find 2 areas, one of which was right here, and another of which was, I think, over here, where the bellows were not fully glued down to the rear standard. So I was able to check that and fix that, put a little glue there and kind of put some pressure on it. and it has been perfectly fine ever since. It probably was kind of a fluke thing. I'm sure almost all the ones out there are glued down perfectly, but just make sure you check it as with any other piece of equipment before going out in the field and use it for anything important. Just make sure everything is fine in that regard. I do wish that the top part of the bellows was a little cleaner looking. So this area here kind of gets pulled tight, and I have no clue how to go about designing bellows or anything, but the sides are kind of nice and uniform there. The top kind of gets pulled there. So it'd be kind of cool if there was some way of having it where it was more uniform there across the whole top area. In a perfect world, it would be nice if you didn't have to have the rear standard in the vertical orientation when folding the camera, but that is just fine because that kind of comes with the territory of keeping the camera as small as it is. So that really isn't all that big of a deal, though I will say that there has been many times where I started folding the camera with this in the horizontal position, only realized that, nope, don't want to do that because I didn't want to force anything there. I did run into something in the field when I was working with the camera having to do with the bellows. And it's something I hadn't experienced with any of my previous cameras, but also I think the bellows on my Ebony and my Arca Swiss are perhaps a little unusual in this regard. But I had the camera configured pretty much as you see right here. A little bit of front rise there, probably, I don't know, maybe a little less than an inch or so of front rise. Vertical orientation. And I didn't realize it at the moment, but the bellows were kind of pinching in on the top. So if you look the way that this is set up, the light from the lens might kind of hit up against this area right here. And I think that also is something that kind of comes with the territory of having such a slim camera. You don't have as forgiving of bellows. And it was something that I didn't know to look for when setting up the photo because I never had anything along those lines with my Ebony or my Arca Swiss. But now that I know about it, I can look for that and then try to avoid it in the field. And it's really just if you shoot vertical, if you shoot horizontal, it's really not a big deal. But overall, I am very, very happy with the Intrepid 8x10 camera. There certainly is room for improvement on a future generation, stuff like double screws there. Maybe if they have some other way of working with the front standard so that straight from the factory works well. And also maybe even better markings on the focusing bed here to keep everything squared up. And when it comes to precision, the Intrepid 8x10 camera is best suited for fairly simple shots. And by that I mean shots that don't involve crazy elaborate movements. It can do them, but it's not going to be as precise and as easy to work with as something along the lines of my Arca Swiss. But that's just because the Arca Swiss, everything is geared and it makes really difficult shots a lot easier. So if you're setting this up for just a normal sort of landscape photo with a little bit of front tilt, maybe a little bit of front rise, that sort of stuff is pretty easy. If you're trying to juggle all sorts of movements, that's where having something that's even more precise would be nice. All the photos I shot on my spring backpacking trip were pretty easy, straightforward shots, which is what most of landscape photography is all about. But if I was going to try to set this camera up, a couple hours before sunrise in the dark by flashlight, which is what I did with my Arca Swiss camera when I was in Death Valley earlier this year, I think that sort of situation would be a little bit more difficult to work with just because the controls aren't geared, but most cameras don't have that level of precision. So for normal sort of photos, this camera is going to be a joy to work with. The more complex stuff would be a little bit more difficult to work with. But this camera has earned a spot in my lineup as my backpacking camera. I appreciate the weight savings, and also it'll be my backup camera in case something were to happen to my Arca Swiss, which is not going to happen. But it's always important to carry two cameras with you just because stuff can happen. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around next time.